4 disclaimers before I really get into this workshop. The first is just a content warning. I am going to talk about rape and sexual assault during this workshop. Presumably it makes some sense as to why I'm going to talk about this, but just a warning before we get into it. Second, a lot of this is very derivative of the workshop on social movements writ large, and so there are many points which I have not gone particularly in depth, specifically on the clashes, and the primary reason for that is just because I gave a bit of material for addressing them in the social movements thing. It's also worth saying that this is just sort of meant to be a jumping off point. So these are the primary things that come up in debates about feminism, and you should do your own research into all of the things that I'm talking about in this workshop and all of the clashes that I'm talking about if you want to debate them particularly well in the future. This is sort of just like a primer. The third disclaimer is that very obviously, I am not a woman, so, get ready to have feminism them-splained to you in, way too short detail to actually get into the weeds of it, so I don't think I'm doing it justice, and I am a voice that you should take with a grain of salt on this, because while it is not irrelevant to me, it is not the most relevant either. The fourth and final disclaimer is just that a lot of the material in here is fairly directly from the sources, so at some instances I basically directly quote them, and the primary reason for this is just because I think the sources put a lot of these things particularly compellingly. And so, just for clarity, that is, some of this is directly from Sharmila, some of this is directly from the workshop by Will, and some of this is directly from the workshop by Ryan. Credit where credit is due. Those are very helpful in forming this, and again, some of the material is pretty directly from there. Anyway, let's get into the workshop. So the sort of standard history that you get of feminism in most Western spheres focuses pretty heavily on the 3 waves of feminism, and yes, I will do that, but it also is worth noting just that, one, this model, the developmental model of feminism that I'm going to use is not one that necessarily represents feminism in every context. There are many contexts that are at various points in this sort of model, and also just it doesn't represent the way in which feminism has played out in many different contexts. And the second thing is just that there is also a large chunk of time before these 3 waves of feminism where proto-feminist thought existed, and proto-feminism was just the long period in which thinkers attacked the assumption that women's subordination was natural before the recent 3 waves of feminism. This is primarily where the arguments to the social creation of women's subordination were forwarded in the first instance, and this kind of created the foundations for feminist 3 waves post that. During proto-feminism, there was a very strong emphasis on education. There were at least 2 reasons for this. The first is just that education is a precondition for being able to exercise your other rights, because without it, you are far more dependent on people around you. And second is just that education is very instrumentalizable. So frequently, women were responsible for educating children, and it is much easier to argue, or it was much easier to argue, that allowing women access to better education was good for other people, because that was more palatable. The other thing to note is just that frequently proto-feminist spaces acted as safe spaces, training grounds and connection spaces for women as well. And this is still generally true of feminist spaces writ large. Okay, the first wave of feminism. The first wave of feminism primarily focused on de jure barriers, so achieving rights for women, granting formal equality to women under the law, that sort of thing. While first wave feminism is most well known for advocating for and advancing women's right to vote, it was by no means limited to that. It also looked like attacking coverture, a lack of property rights, exclusion from higher education, the inability to enter many professions, unequal divorce and custody law, and many other legal ways in which women were barred from having access to equal rights. Coverture, by the way, was a principle in English common law that when a woman married a man, her rights were then subsumed by him. She could not own property, sign contracts, receive wages, etc. One of the primary criticisms of the first wave of feminism was a distinct lack of intersectionality. So while the right for women to vote in the US was won in 1920, the 19th Amendment did not secure voting rights for many Black women, Indigenous women, or other women facing racialized disenfranchisement via literacy tests and citizenship exclusion and stuff like that. In fact, the Civil War and the 15th Amendment represented a major fracture in the feminist movement, as the 15th Amendment prohibited racial discrimination and voting for men, but it didn't enfranchise women, and as a result, many white suffragists responded with overtly racist arguments, claiming that white women deserved the vote more than black men. So suddenly, black women and other women of color frequently had to fight both sexism within racial justice movements and racism within feminist movements, creating a pretty intense double burden. In imperial contexts, feminists frequently racistly portrayed colonized men as uniquely oppressive towards women and Western states as saviors, and this is something that is reflected in a lot of the interventions that the United States and the West writ large participate in, where frequently it is justified to the extent that it is saving women and children, and that obviously optically is quite bad and pretty racist. It makes sense that intersectional representation has pretty major barriers in the way of it. That is just that wealthier voices simply have more money and more social influence and are far more in line with the sorts of voices that people are used to listening to already. Additionally, in university programs studying things like gender and sexuality, the types of universities that on average fund studies of things like the history of feminism tend to be considerably wealthier, considerably more exclusive, and considerably more privileged institutions. And what that often means is that the type of research or the type of literature produced often tends to favor a relatively more wealthy or relatively more white voice of feminism. Generally, the focus of the first wave of feminism was on foundational rights, so the right to own property, the right to be educated, the right to vote, legal entry into various professions, etc. Once these rights were won, the question of what women should do with these rights began to arise, and that generated a large number of splits in the feminist movement. But prior to that, it was a sort of common enemy situation, where you want access to these rights regardless of how you want to exercise those rights, and therefore you can kind of band together just to have access in the first place. Within the first wave, there was a major split on reasoning for rights. One argument was that women deserve rights because they are equal, rational individuals who are no different from men. Another argument said that women deserve political voice because they are morally different. They're more peaceful, they're more ethical, and less corrupt than men. This framing was frequently advantageous because opponents frequently accused feminists of being unfeminine, of being sexually deviant and socially destructive. So leaning into modesty standards, Christian virtue, maternal duty, that sort of thing, very much helped counter this sort of backlash. But it also narrowed the movement and made it more difficult to defend women who did not fit into these standards, and frequently these were the most vulnerable women because they didn't fit into the social standards that we expected at the time. The second wave of feminism. The second wave of feminism focused far more on de facto barriers, so social structures that bar women from positions of power, employment discrimination, sexual double standards, domestic violence, cultural norms of subservience, etc. Many women were told that they had technically achieved equality because they had citizenship rights, yet their actual lives were still very heavily constrained by things like marriage expectations. So one of the primary splits of the second wave of feminism is to do with women selling their sexuality. There are a couple of feminist arguments which are frequently advanced against sex work. The first is just that certain things shouldn't be commodified, and sex happens to be one of those things because it is, for many people, so deep-seatedly tied to things like consent and privacy and yourself, such that the way that sex work is experienced by a sex worker is so vastly different from the way that construction work is experienced by a construction worker, even though both are embodied forms of labor, because in the context of sex work, the separation between the self and body is just harder to mentally enforce, and therefore what you're selling in sex is not simply a service which is detachable from you, or even renting out your body for a temporary period of time. What you're renting out is yourself in a very real sense because of the connection of the self to the person's identity, and thus it is frequently deeply traumatic as a form of work. A second argument is just that sex work is an adaptive preference, so people in situations of oppression may form adaptive preferences that lead to behaviors which are not in their interest. Adaptive preferences are preferences that are inconsistent with one's well-being, that are formed under situations that are not conducive to one's well-being, that frequently outlive those situations, which we can reasonably expect individuals to change under conditions that are more conducive to their well-being. In these instances, the state should have an obligation to intervene because you're not acting in a way that you would act, presuming that you had access to all of the information surrounding you. In effect, you're acting in a way that is harmful to you. The third argument is just that this is not a truly agentic choice because your choice was coerced, and legitimizing this coercion deprives women of getting to a point where they can make truly uncoerced choices. That is, the identity of women is constructed by institutions. Who you are, what you regard as important to you, etc., what you think is appropriate as conduct, isn't something that just randomly dropped from the sky into your brain. It was something that was created by the social context in which you live. And it was created in a million imperceptible ways by every institution or thing that you encountered in your life, starting starting with the day that you were handed a toy that was gendered. Your identity did not, in some magical way, exist outside of that fact, or outside of the fact that you were told that a woman who expresses her sexuality is a slut and a man is a stud. And so the sort of coercion that can be harnessed here is just to say that the conditions into which you exist are ones that coerce you to believe certain things, and therefore you are not making a truly consensual choice. It is worth acknowledging, in addition to all of this, that many sex workers are just truly the victims of sex trafficking, and in those instances, it isn't even a question if they had the agency in getting into the line of work in the first place, because you know that they didn't. If you would like to hear a much better argument against these than I could offer, go watch the supplemental material. It's got the second one, the one by Sharmila, is particularly good. But here are a few things that you should consider in any sex work debate. First, is sex work inherently degrading or dehumanizing in a way that differs from other forms of labor? Second, what is the alternative? Because frequently it's low paying, frequently it is similarly unsafe, and frequently it involves sexual harassment, so long factory working hours, care work, etc. Third, what is the effect on women in general? Is it true that there is such a sort of externalized impact that is so bad on women as a result of sex work? Fourth, what incentives are created by the sort of intervention that you are using in a debate that talks about intervention to solve for sex work? For example, For example, banning sex work or banning buying sex work, even if you don't ban the provision of it, reduces the number of good customers involved because it makes there a strong incentive for the individuals who would normally work under the law to not involve themselves, to not buy this sort of labor. And as a result, you kind of narrow down the range of customers to being customers who are the worst sorts of people in society, the people who don't abide by laws, the people who don't really care whether or not they're abusive in these conditions, and that sort of thing. The sex work debate also unveiled a deep tension that undergirds the third wave of feminism. Specifically, if women's desires are shaped under patriarchy, how should feminism distinguish agency from internalized domination as a result of patriarchy? Because we know that acts done under duress are not manifestations of agency, but also agency doesn't just mean acting in the way that you or I think people should. So where does the line get drawn? And where that line got drawn became a fairly major feminist contention in the second wave and moving into the third wave. One of the primary characteristics of the second wave was that of consciousness raising. So women gathered in groups to discuss their personal experiences, marriage, sex, workplace humiliation, body image, harassment, etc., which unveiled the structural nature of many of the conditions which politically confined women's personal lives. Very obviously, the second wave of feminism has had pretty massive success. Workplace harassment is now a form of workplace discrimination. Marital rape is now recognized as a crime, and it wasn't at all prior. Domestic violence is now a highly public issue. Also very obviously, though, women still face many de facto barriers to equality, and so, unsurprisingly, a large amount of the ideology from the second wave of feminism is still very alive right now. The second wave of feminism was not very intersectional either. It centered around the white, middle-class, heterosexual woman's experience. Women of color and working-class women often experienced gender subordination extensively differently. For example, take the feminine mystique. Its central image is the educated middle class, often white housewife who's trapped in domesticity despite material comfort. While many poor women and women of color were not primarily fighting to escape the home into paid work. They'd always worked in exploitative, low-paid, racialized labor markets. The problem for them was just that they were exploited both inside and outside of the home, which represented a fairly different plight with pretty different solutions. Also, women outside of the Western context often deal with a wholly different configuration of power. The answer to the question of what structures act oppressively for them also differs radically. So, for example, the problem in those contexts was frequently more de jure, that is, land rights, wages, labor protections, etc. And when it wasn't, it still differed radically from Western context because it was different social constructs. The second wave of feminism still struggled with what to do with essentialist theming as well. Some second wave feminists spoke about women as though women shared a natural or universal relation to care, motherhood, or victimization. And while this drove solidarity within the movement in some ways, it also still excluded some women who did not identify with those things, or with binary sex categories, for example. as a side note, which I think is pretty cool, later feminist theory changed assumptions by redefining women as a socially constructed category, or some portions of later feminist theory did this, which is malleable. That is, that the movement itself is able to move what it is to be a woman in such a way that feminism can still organize coherently without assuming one essence of womanhood because it changes over time. One other battle that emerged in the second wave was whether or not feminists should prioritize the fight for equal treatment on male terms or for gender-neutral or gender-conscious accommodations. And this is a very difficult to answer question, because each has its own sort of drawbacks that come with it. For example, maternity protections can help women remain in work, but if only women receive caregiving leave, then employers might discriminate against them or assume that, care is a woman's responsibility. The third wave of feminism emerged in the late 1980s and 1990s, and just for context, the second wave is roughly said to have emerged in the 1960s. I don't think I said that. But yes, the third wave emerged in the late 1980s and 1990s. And it emerged as both a continuation of second wave feminism and a rebellion against second wave feminism. Third wave feminism, in large part, embraced the intersectionality-based critiques of the second wave of feminism. One of the insights of the third wave of feminism was that a black woman facing discrimination is probably not just experiencing racism plus sexism as two sort of separable layers. Rather, she might face a distinct form of discrimination that laws or norms that are meant to address race and sex separately may not be effective at addressing. This shift from analyzing what is good for women in a vacuum to analyzing what is good based on the concentric circles of oppression that surround women in various contexts was particularly important, because it finally put the tools to understand why reforms that helped some women may not help others at the forefront of feminist theory. So, for example, carceral feminism may help some survivors of domestic abuse, while expanding policing in prisons frequently harms more marginalized communities. Third-wave feminism generally embraced sexual liberation and choice feminism. The emphasis changed from making truly uncoerced decisions to acknowledging that every choice that literally everyone makes is coerced by the context around them, and instead focusing on supporting the choices that women make and clearing the way for women to make less immediately coerced decisions. So, for example, provided the ability to choose to do otherwise, third-wave feminism generally sees things like sex work, being a stay-at-home mother, or participating in beauty culture as an exercise of your own agency, and when there isn't that choice, frequently the focus is on creating pathways for that choice to be possible in the first place. Third-wave feminism, as previously mentioned, radically challenged rigid gender categories as well, making the space considerably more inclusive for gender non-conforming people. While second-wave feminism grew out of first-wave feminism, third-wave feminism is more at odds with second-wave feminism, while still having grown out of it and inherited large portions of it. Second-wave ideology within the feminist movement writ large is still very alive, and so the tension between these two portions of the movement is quite real. Of course, all of this is a very drastic oversimplification because none of these waves are anywhere near as homogeneous as I painted them out to be. But that's a rough over-the-top overview of the three waves of feminism. Let's talk about some major splits in the movement. The first split is just on choice feminism, as already covered. It is true that patriarchal socialization does predispose you to make decisions which do reinforce norms that exist in society, and choice feminists say that women's choices, even influenced, are empowering by themselves, regardless of whether or not they filter into stereotypes. Choice feminism is arguably good for at least the following reasons. First, individual women just do know their preferences best, and so it probably should be up to them to make decisions. Second, calling out women is generally counterproductive because all it achieves is alienation from the movement itself, and if these women are so horribly oppressed, well, they probably need the space the most and probably shouldn't be alienated from it. Third, choice feminism just makes the movement more palatable generally because, one, it doesn't alienate women, and two, it frequently filters into or says, you are good for doing the things that we already sort of societally associate with being okay. The second split is on sexualization, and I've already covered this pretty extensively, and it also is a part of the debate on choice feminism, so I'm not going to go over that one again. Third split, lean-in feminism. A specific strand of feminism says that women should, at least initially, lean into norms in male-dominated environments with the hopes of achieving stable careers and potentially pushing through the glass ceiling individually, such that they can hopefully create paths for people to follow them in the future. This, very obviously, is not a particularly accessible strategy, but it does have the benefit of being probably an easier way of breaking into workplaces in the first place, and it is easier to change the norms inside of a workplace once you are in that to begin with. Split number 4, gender inclusion. This very rarely comes up in debate, but it is worth remembering that there is a large section of feminism that advocates for trans exclusionary spaces. And so while it isn't probably going to come up as a debate around that, it is something that is worth remembering exists within the feminist movement writ large. Fifth split, equality versus difference. I've already covered this pretty extensively as well, but difference feminism emphasizes the way in which men and women are different without putting any moral value on those differences, whereas equality feminism advocates for more of an androgynous worldview and tries to erase these sorts of differences that exist. Next topic, different contexts of the feminist movement. The first thing to say is just there are many areas where there are de jure barriers in the way of women's equality still, and this meaningfully shapes the form of advocacy that is most effective. So it is generally worth thinking about what actual legal barriers exist in the context you're debating about, and also what social barriers exist. But the legal barriers frequently shape the way that advocacy is most effective, because obviously legal barriers are pretty intense. Second, different cultural norms meaningfully shape what women in different contexts see as liberation from patriarchal systems. So it may just be the case that in one context it is liberation to have X thing happened, and in another context that is far more than people want in terms of liberation, or it just literally isn't seen as liberation because maybe engaging in this form of activity is actually something that is liberating for women in a different cultural context. Third, because women compose roughly half of the world's population, feminism is a particularly intersectional movement, and it is frequently worth thinking about how different structures of oppression do overlap. So, for example, as previously given, any debate on carceral feminism, and how debates affect feminist portions of other movements, for example. So, for example, feminist portions of labor movements. Why does Western feminism have such a bad image in large portions of the developing world? I can think of at least 5 reasons why this is likely. The first is just that there is a strong association with cultural imperialism. So when Western feminists say women should be free from violence, coercion, and subordination, frequently this means something more along the lines of women are liberated only if they are secular, individualist, sexually autonomous, and sort of westernized. And this makes feminism appear far more like a project of cultural conversion than it is a struggle against domination as a result of norms. And many developing contexts where colonial memory is still very politically salient, a movement that arrives with this sort of Western moral certainty is likely to be read as a continuation of colonial pedagogy. So that is, we are modern, you're backward, we will teach you how to treat women. Second, additionally, Western feminist critique frequently uses practices such as veiling arranged marriage as shorthand for oppression without actually consulting the people who participate in these practices. And so these are the sorts of things where it's sure, yes, this to you feels like something that is oppressive, and it probably is to some extent oppressive, but many different people might have the opinions that it isn't something that is oppressive for them to do. The second reason is just that Western states frequently invoke women's rights selectively and to their advantage, such as when sanctioning rivals, funding preferred NGOs, or legitimizing intervention, as we've talked about. And at the same time, frequently they downplay or just outright accept similar abuse by allies. And this construes feminism itself as a sort of geopolitical tactic more than it is an actual movement for liberation. The third reason is just because of the nature of cross-border interventions. So, for example, through NGO pathways, UN agencies, development consultants, etc., Western feminist efforts in developing contexts frequently lose their grassroots appeal as they might have in Western contexts, and instead are far more likely to appear as impositions, just to the extent that they are literally imposed by external bodies that have the most funding to prioritize these sorts of wants. And this also runs a real risk of ignoring those who need to be prioritized the most, because local organizations which succeed are the ones who learn to appeal to Western foundations rather than local constituencies. And advocacy as a result of that becomes urban and elite. The fourth reason is just that there is an intense goal mismatch. So a rural woman facing water scarcity likely doesn't gain all that much from a workshop about representation in corporate leadership. And the result is that frequently Western feminism is at best seen as helping privileged women become equal to privileged men. Fifth, Western feminists focus on things that are frequently controversial, so sexual liberation, secular values, that sort of thing. And this allows for backlash to be particularly strong against any group with ties to them, which creates strong incentives for local women's rights groups to distance themselves from the broader feminist movement itself. I think it is frequently worth thinking about and illustrating the ways in which women's choices are constrained by power structures. So, to name a few, first, you are locked out of systems of capital accumulation. You don't write the rules of the game, and therefore the rules are shifted to disadvantage you. This frequently looks like laws around marriage, laws around inheritance, laws around labor, and that sort of thing being written in ways that are just a little bit disadvantageous for you, and that decreases your ability to accumulate capital over time. Second, social norms are often indoctrinated into the minds of children, especially girls, when they are still very young. So, for example, as I think I talked about previously, dolls, Disney princess movies, etc. Third, social pressures, whether implicit or explicit, so for example, outright pressures from family, frequently influence your decisions. So who you get married to, the career you opt into, the level of education you aim for, that sort of thing. Fourth, many subtle factors just subconsciously mold people's preferences and beliefs about how they should live their lives. So, for example, beauty company ads, or the way that notable women in history are taught, or just the way that famous women are portrayed in media. Okay, let's talk about some common clashes with regards to the feminist movement. The first common clash that I will very briefly discuss is just, because we'll come back to this later in narratives, is X norm or thing good for women. I think it is frequently worth pointing out when this debate comes up, the countervailing pressures that exist and why they would be overwhelming without this thing, and the result of that would be bad. Second clash, incremental versus radical reform. Very obviously, this is the same sort of clash you get in many different contexts, but radical side strategy looks like saying that incremental reform might not work. You shift the Overton window, and incremental reform, even if it does work, only helps those best off who need help the least, whereas the radical side of things gets to those most vulnerable. And then you can weigh heavily on that while acknowledging that there is still some amount of uncertainty within whether or not radical reform will actually succeed. On incremental side strategy, I think the primary thing to do is just to make this very real and to not forget to explain why it is likely that it will be successful, that the efforts will actually succeed. But make it real with illustrations, make the impacts very clear. The third clash, and the one that I'll spend the most time on because I think it is the one that is most unique to the feminist movement, is just forced representation. These are typically in media or in politics. Media first. This debate generally boils down to two clashes. First, a debate about whether it will be done poorly or done well. One sneaky way to frequently win this debate is to say that even if this is done poorly immediately, it will become better over time as there is a competition for nuance, as the roles get shaped to the preferences of women who fill them, and as women gain more market power, etc. Second, even if it is done poorly, you can say that maybe it will have good or bad results. And so there's kind of a double burden on the side that is against media representation in this debate to explain, one, why it is not going to be done poorly, over time included, and two, why it is that even when you have poor representation, it is a bad thing, because the other side can kind of just say, well, sure, maybe it's done poorly, but the increase in representation is good for XYZ reasons. Second, in politics, there are at least 6 tools that can be used to increase women's political representation in politics. The first is just candidate quotas, so rules requiring that a certain share of candidates nominated by political parties must be women. These can either be legislated quotas, such as in Argentina and France, or voluntary party quotas adopted by parties internally, such as in many Nordic parties. These, by themselves, are often particularly ineffective, as without placement rules, things like zipper lists where gender alternates, which we'll return to in a second, parties can put women in unwinnable positions. So, for example, at the bottom of the lists, or just in unwinnable constituencies. Second, reserved seats. A certain number of seats in elected bodies can be set aside for women, filled either by direct election or indirect party nominations. The third thing that you could do is zipper or placement mandates, which require alternating genders on party lists or a minimum share of women in winnable positions. The fourth thing that frequently is used is just financial incentives or sanctions, so simply tying portions of party funding to gender balance. The examples of this include France, where parties that meet parity are fined, and Mexico, which reduces state subsidization for noncompliance. Mexico is one of the global leaders on gender parity laws, so feel free to go read up about that. The fifth thing is just capacity building and training programs, so initiatives to train, mentor, and financially support women Generally, these are quite good at tackling underlying structural barriers that lead to underrepresentation, and frequently are quite useful at accompanying some of the other tactics we've talked about. Sixth, some institutional structures can just make women's representation easier or harder. So, for example, systems that utilize proportional representation tend to elect more women than first-past-the-post systems, because in proportional representation, several representatives are elected from each district. So parties present a list of candidates from which representatives are picked from the top down, proportional to the party's success in the election, which allows them to include women without displacing male incumbents directly. So why might it be good to have more women represented in politics? Because I do think quite legitimately, while it is intuitively the case that this is true, it is something that is somewhat difficult to impact out, and so I'm going to go through some examples of how you might impact this out, and hopefully that will be useful. The first is just very obviously, this looks like representation, and representation is important for a very large number of reasons. So, for example, the fact that you are represented more means that you maybe push back more on the sort of coercive nature of patriarchal norms. In your childhood, you might have individuals that you look up to, that you're more able to aspire to, that sort of thing. It also just means more tangibly that your sorts of wants will be more frequently represented. So very obviously, men deprioritize policy, which would be good for women, considering silent work as a part of GDP or creating a social dividend for it isn't something that crosses the mind of the majority of men. Deterring sexual assault just doesn't seem as important to you if you don't often feel at risk of sexual assault. And so, as a result, men frequently just deprioritize because they don't understand the intensity of some of these problems. Two additional reasons that I think are particularly compelling as to why this is good. The first is just that there's an experiential gap. So even when addressing policy concerns like those listed above, women facing the brunt of the problem just do understand it better. They often better know the intricacies that have to be accounted for. So for example, something like street lighting for men policymakers is often a matter of public utility, whereas for women, it often is a matter of public safety and how comfortable you feel. Second, there's often a level of uncomfortability that accompanies men discussing policy concerns in this area that A, discourages it, and B, rushes it when it's done. You feel like you're the problem, which is not a comfortable thought process. You feel uncomfortable talking about these sorts of things, and as a result, this policy just gets mentally deprioritized, even if you don't intend to deprioritize it. The other side is more difficult, though. So why might forced representation be bad? Because there are some debates that are just, especially in Yodel, that are about forced representation, and so sometimes you will have to oppose this sort of thing. So I'm going to work through a sort of case as to why you might say that it is something that is bad. The first thing is just that when quotas or gender-based parity systems are implemented, there's a very strong incentive and existing capacity to maintain pre-existing patriarchal structures. So men face a choice. Either they A, give up power voluntarily, that is, displace themselves, lose patronage networks, control over funding, etc., or B, they adapt the system to look compliant but retain informal control. And rationally, most political elites choose option B. So what does this look like? I think it looks like candidate placement games where women are nominated in unwinnable districts to fulfill just quota requirements or placed at the bottom of lists where they will never be selected for representation, as we talked about before. Second, though, it looks like proxy candidacy, so connections or wives or daughters stand in for entrenched men, publicly pressured to step down either upon election or after election if rotating systems, or just simply handing over most of the decisions to the entrenched elite figures. And I think this is all fairly easy for a few reasons. The first is just that men still dominate party landscapes, so that is party leadership, nomination committees, campaign finance, managers. These are all overwhelmingly male positions, which has two implications. First, because women are nominated by their parties and campaigns require intense accumulations of money and networks, men generally act as political gatekeepers of women's access to candidacy. Male leaders, upon appointment, become patrons of women who owe their positions to male party power brokers, and this gives nominated women minimal control over their own policy agendas. Second, to make matters worse, parties can threaten optics in future elections, giving a choice between co-optation and political suicide, and this serves the purpose of either further regulating policy or, in many instances, not allowing women to build up the institutional knowledge that comes with multiple terms in office that serves as a strong advantage in gaining seniority and efficiently passing policy. Effectively, even if quotas require women candidates, it's men who choose which women, where to place them, how much support they'll get, and the vast majority of their policy agendas. Second, though, men still dominate the old boys clubs that form behind closed political doors. They dominate donor networks, corporate ties, and media visibility, resources without which women cannot compete effectively. And third, while it is particularly easy to find loopholes surrounding women's candidacies, it is not particularly easy to fill in those loopholes. Intuitively, this is because it is vastly unpopular among elected politicians to do so. For males, this obviously represents a forced displacement, a loss of patronage networks, etc. And for elected women, it is often less obvious but still true in many instances that they don't want to get rid of these things. The first is that they have already shown willingness to bend to patriarchal power systems. Mental barriers have already been broken through, and so there isn't that much of an aversion to doing it in the future. The second is just that many appointed women owe their spots to loopholes that allow patriarchal structures to exist, and it would be detrimental to their political careers, i.e. by allowing competition that might drive them out of office, to correct the loopholes. Why is this all particularly pernicious? First, it deals considerable damage to any representational impact that the other side might be able to garner as a result of these sorts of policies. Why? First, if you are told that all or the majority of the women who found their way into successful political careers explicitly got there through corrupt means, whereby men allowed preferred candidates to take office, you probably will not, as a woman considering it who actually wants to make a change, want to go into politics in the first place. And psychologically, we prefer to have upright moral interpretations of ourselves, so very few people are open to becoming a corrupt person, and at the very least, you don't want to be perceived as corrupt, which poses a very strong counter-incentive. Additionally, if politics looks like a hopeless field for fighting patriarchal structures, easier avenues open themselves up. So, for example, grassroots organizations, which women with these incentives filter into instead. Second, note that this point is not particularly reliant on on all or even the vast majority of women who are elected being actually corrupt. This is primarily because psychologically, people are more apt to notice the cases where women are proven to be corrupt over the instances where they aren't because of natural negativity bias, not to mention that media likely picks up on those stories more. And these cases then paint our understanding of politics. Even if women politicians are elected legitimately in the majority of instances, media coverage and human bias is to expect corruption behind the scenes. Why are you likely then to see, and this is the second important burden of any argument like this, because at this point we've just explained why the policy is bad, and maybe it is true that we can weaponize that to say that having the policy in place is worse than not having it in place. But also a second burden is quite useful to explain why the lack of the policy is considerably better than having the policy in place, which is, why is it that you are likely to see increases in women's political representation over time on the side of the house that you're on in a way that is nefariously co-opted and delegitimized on the other side? The first reason is just that psychologically it is far more easy to convince a man that a woman should have X rights than it is to convince a woman that they shouldn't have X right, and as a result, when it comes to positive rights, incremental shifts over time in positive directions are to be expected. Second, demonstration effects, where a few women win office, they act as political role models, normalizing women in politics, and over time this reduces voter bias and encourages more women to run. And note the explicit comparative, because on the other side of the house, you are told that women candidates are largely illegitimate and corrupt. Voter bias is accentuated, and role models never form because the vast majority are painted in bad lighting. Third, global norm diffusion. So international organizations form over time that encourage the buildup of skills required for accessing political positions, and on the comparative, there's just less pressure on these institutions to exist in the first place because it feels as though the problem of representation has been solved. Okay, hopefully that sort of case study was somewhat useful here, because I think it is legitimately quite difficult to attack this specific debate on that side, and it is a debate that comes up every once in a while. That's all for the workshop today, so I'll catch you all tomorrow.